Tonight we're going to pick up our study, continuing to look at King Rehoboam. Last Wednesday night we left off around 1 Kings chapter 14, so if you want to follow along in your Bible, that's where we're going to begin tonight, 1 Kings chapter 14, talking about King Rehoboam. Well, Rehoboam was 41 years old when his father Solomon passed away, and he ascended to the throne of Israel. At the time of his ascension, the kingdom was still united, but shortly after his ascension to the throne, due to a poor decision that he made by taking the advice of the young men of the kingdom rather than his father's wise counselors, the kingdom divided. And we find that 2 of the 12 tribes remained with Rehoboam because God had promised Solomon that although the kingdom would divide, that he would allow a portion of that kingdom to remain under the control of someone of David's lineage. And so 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, remain with Rehoboam, and they form a nation known as Judah. The other 10 tribes, they go to the north, and they take Jeroboam as their king, and they establish a kingdom known as Israel. Now Rehoboam, there's really not a lot recorded about this man after this poor decision that he made. As we talked a little bit last week, he had initially intended to go to war with the 10 tribes that had left to try to bring the nation all back together, but he heeded God's warning not to do this, and so the kingdom remained divided. Well, during the reign of Rehoboam, he did absolutely nothing to correct the problems that Solomon had allowed to come into the kingdom. In fact, we're told that the practice of idolatry continued during his reign, that the perverse nature of the worship of many of those false gods continued during that time. And we read a passage in 2 Chronicles chapter 12 and verse 1 that tells us that Rehoboam forsook the law of the Lord and all Israel along with him. And so all of that nation that remained with him, they continued in the false practices that were already taking place in that kingdom. Well, we find that during Rehoboam's 5th year on the throne, a man by the name of Shishak, and I may be pronouncing that wrong, but he was the king of Egypt at the time, and he came in and he laid siege to the nation of Judah. He came into Jerusalem and he carried away many of those great treasures that we read about when we studied the life and reign of Solomon. He carried away many of the riches of the temple, many of the riches of the king's palace, and carried those things back to Egypt. Well, as we see, God stated that the reason that this took place was because Rehoboam and that nation had forsook God, because they had turned away from him. Therefore, he was no longer protecting that nation. And so what happened, this invasion of Egypt, was in direct response or a direct consequence of Judah's sinfulness against God. Well, trying to rebuild part of what had been carried away, we're told that Rehoboam apparently did not have the gold and the precious gems at his disposal that his father had. And so in trying to rebuild some of the things that were there, it particularly talks about the bronze shields that he had made. You remember when we talked about Solomon, it talked about the large and small shields of gold that he had made for himself. Well, to replace those shields of gold, Rehoboam replaced those with shields of bronze. And most people believe that this was an indication of just how far the nation had declined in its prosperity just in these few short years from the time of Solomon into these 5 years that Rehoboam had been on the throne. But then a prophet by the name of Shemaiah comes and he brings a message from God to Rehoboam, telling Rehoboam why all of this had happened. Well, to their credit, the leaders of the nation and Rehoboam, when they heard this message, they humbled themselves before God. They proclaimed the Lord as righteous. And because they humbled themselves, God did not allow the Egyptians to come in and completely destroy that nation. Yes, they carried away many of the riches of the nation. But the nation was allowed to stand, was allowed to remain intact. And the reason for this, we read that after Rehoboam humbled himself, things began to go much better in the nation of Judah. When Rehoboam shifted his focus back to God, things began to be better again. But something that we're going to find beginning at this point, there is never again going to be peace between these two nations, between Israel and Judah. There is constantly, from this point forward, going to be animosity, constantly going to be fussing and fighting and turmoil taking place. It all begins at this point. Well, after Rehoboam had been on the throne for 17 years, he passed away. We're told that he was buried in the city of David, and his son, a man by the name of Abijam, took his place. Well, in 2 Chronicles chapter 12 and verse 14, we find a final analysis of Rehoboam's life. It says, he did evil because he did not prepare his heart to seek the Lord. Folks, that's not a very good legacy. It's not one that anyone would desire to have. And we find that even though there was a period of time where it seems that Rehoboam, at least temporarily, had tried to shift his focus and the nation's focus back to God, the things that reigned supreme, the things that continued to be remembered about him and his practices, was that he was an evil king. He did evil because he did not seek the Lord. So what are a couple of applications that we see from the life of Rehoboam? Well, first, it's important to always seek wise counsel. This is what started the whole downfall of Rehoboam in the first place. He did not listen to wise counsel. You know, Solomon wrote in Proverbs 12 and verse 15, he said, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he who heeds counsel is wise. Well, Rehoboam is not remembered as wise because he did not heed wise counsel. He listened to the opinion, he listened to the directing of his contemporaries, those young men, those who felt that he did not need to give the kingdom an inch, that he needed to retain his position and his power over them. Whereas the older, wiser counselors, they said, you know, you really need to serve the people. You need to listen to what they have to say. And if they think that things are a little too difficult on them, maybe you need to back off a little bit. That was the wise counsel. That's what would have kept that kingdom together for a little while longer. But that's not what Rehoboam did. And so the message that we can take from this is, folks, we always need to be willing to seek out wise counsel. We don't always need to be going around looking for someone who's just going to tell us what we want to hear. You know, that's what we like. You know, we like to hear that what we think is right or what we're doing is right. But you know, sometimes the best advice we can receive is what we don't want to hear. I think we all would agree with that. Sometimes the best advice we could receive is what we don't want to hear. Well, that's how it was with Rehoboam. But Rehoboam, rather than humbling himself, rather than seeing himself as a servant of the people, he wouldn't do this. He stubbornly and arrogantly refused to submit to what the people wanted to do, to the advice of these older, wiser counselors. He refused to submit to that. And as a result, he made the foolish decision that led to the division of that kingdom. Well, folks, we understand that any time that we resist that which is wise, any time we go against that which is right, it's not going to have a good outcome. But also with Rehoboam, we never see in the Scriptures where Rehoboam acknowledged that he had made a mistake. Even after this decision he made led to the division of that kingdom, rather than admit his mistake, he was ready to go to war to fight for his position. To fight for what he thought needed to be done. Well, we need to understand that any time that we allow our pride to lead us to making a decision or standing for something that is not right, we need to understand that we have taken a foolish position. We cannot allow our pride to keep us from doing that which is right. And we find that Rehoboam finally displayed a little bit of wisdom after the prophet came to him and told him what he had done wrong. But evidently that didn't last, because we find that what he is remembered for is the fact that he was not prepared to serve the Lord. He did evil in the sight of God.